All right. Keep going. All right. Ooh, too loud. All right. Okay. Welcome again to Intro to Social Methods. Okay, so today we are going to get started on survey research and talking about like elements of kind of design when it comes to surveys. So obviously that'll be really relevant for next week. Before I get into that, any questions you might have about anything? Where's my tea? There it is. Any questions about the lab that's coming up? Again, due on Sunday at midnight. Anything at all? Good? Everyone's good? Okay. You're all good with the content from last time on quantitative research, everything? No lingering questions causing you concern you need to ask before we jump in? Yeah, please.
The question we developed in the first lab, we got kind of feedback that like, no, this wouldn't work because of this. Like, can we like just totally go in a different direction and make a new question entirely?
Of course, yeah. I mean, if you want to run it by me, just send me an email and I can give you feedback on whatever you revised as well. So, yeah. All right. Well, I guess if there are no other questions, let's jump into survey research. Okay. All right. So this is pretty straightforward, right? When we're talking about designing a survey, you can kind of go in two directions. The more typical one that we use is closed questions, because they're a lot in quantitative research. They are a lot easier to deal with. Okay, so open question, right? This is basically where you would have something like, in a phone interview, you would ask someone, what do you think about Justin Trudeau? And they would tell you in their own words. So basically they can answer however they wish. And as I think I mentioned last time, one of the challenges with open questions is that you then have to code the data, right? So you have to create a bunch of codes, right? You're going to have basically codes that encompass everything that people could say, right? So it has to be exhaustive. You have to have all these mutually exclusive categories, right? Because they can't overlap in any way. And so ends up being kind of a pain at times, right? So in general, you can have them, right? And sometimes you want to limit what's possible in them. The most common ones, I think, are like maybe you have an option in some questions to answer other, right? Like if there's another option, I don't know, if you ask people about their religion and their religion doesn't happen to be, covered by the options you gave, then they can answer in another way, right? And they can tell you, I'm Druze. It doesn't fit on your questionnaire of what religion are you, right? Because you have just the main kind of big ones. That is a little bit easier to code, right? But generally open questions, most people tend to stay away from them just because they do pose a significant challenge, and it can really complicate data and data analysis, because before you can get into anything, you have to go through and basically code all of it. And it's, depending on how many surveys you have, it can be really, really time consuming. So what we tend to see more is closed questions, right? And this is, like when I showed you some questions with Likert scales, that's what a closed question looks like, right? So you've got, some kind of question or a statement, and you've got a set number of responses that the person can choose. And this is, it does take some tailoring to make sure that you're asking the right kinds of questions and you're giving the right kinds of responses. But in general, it's a lot easier to work with the data from closed questions than open ones. Okay. Advantages, right? What are the advantages? I told you all the bad things about open questions. What are the advantages? Sometimes, you in your, ivory tower as a researcher might not think of everything that's exactly possible, right? So people can write in things that you might not have thought of, right? So this is, again, it's complicated because you have to code the data. Yeah, so I have my little comic, right? 87% of the 56% who completed more than 23% of the survey thought it was a waste of time. That you might find that an open question. Um, Unprompted knowledge, right? Things that you didn't think to ask about, people can just throw into open kind of comment areas, and this can, give you new avenues. I would think that's most useful in like a pilot study where you're trying out, your questions, and it might, let you know things you haven't thought about, but it'd be much more difficult if you then send out 3,000 surveys and you're trying to make sense of unprompted knowledge. It's going to slow down the process. Yeah, I mean, the importance of issues can be examined for the respondents. And yeah, then you can use it, especially if you do it as a pilot study, you can use it to create fixed choice answers later on. So they're not completely useless, but it can get very, very complicated. Yeah. In disadvantages, it's more time consuming. Answers have to be coded. Less convenient to compose an answer. Right. So yeah, even people who are responding might generally find it more troublesome to actually fill in these kinds of boxes, right? Or to tell you things. It can, especially let's say someone's doing an online survey. If you have too many open questions, people may quit your survey, right? Because it's just slow, right? And you have to think about it. You have to really think about what you say. There's also the problem. There's also the problem sometimes with these questions that people will start to treat them almost like an answer set, but a little bit different. That you're going to get like 2-word answers, right? Because people will just get tired of writing in these kinds of boxes, and they'll give you really useless answers that are just like a sentence or 2 sentences or almost nothing. So they might not give it the amount of thought you want them to. If you're doing, phone interviewing or in-person interviewing, which is going to be pretty rare in quantitative research now because nobody answers the phone anymore, and doing these things in person is pretty rare. It might require transcribing, right? So everything's going to have to be recorded, and then you're going to have to transcribe it. And can I tell you a story about one of my ethical breaches when I was doing my research? It was a pretty serious one, to be honest. Please don't report me. I think it's probably past the statute of limitations at this point anyway. So I interviewed a bunch of people for my PhD project, and I recorded them. We did all of them on Skype at the time, and I recorded all the interviews, and it was great. And then came time to transcribe them, and I bought the fancy little pedal for your computer so you can stop and start the recording and everything. And I transcribed my first interview, which was 2 hours, and it took me about 16 hours to transcribe it. And I was like, God damn, I have 25 of these to do. I'm never going to finish. So I went online, and I found a transcription service that charges $1 a minute. And I was like, yeah, I got $800. And I paid $800 to get them transcribed. And frankly, that was a bit of an ethical lapse on my part because that was not something my participants had agreed to. And I didn't tell them. I just did it because it's a giant pain in the butt. And now only you and every other class I've ever told this to, which is most of them, now know the horrible thing I did. Transcribing is painful. It's painful. Some people are really good at it. Like my boss pays one person who's like really quick at it just to do that. That's like her whole job. Like a 20-hour a week kind of part-time job. It's horrible. I hate it. Anything that requires me to transcribe, I immediately like get my eyes roll back in my head, and I want to die a little bit. So, transcribing is a pain, and anything where if someone's giving you like a 5-minute spoken answer, there goes an hour of your time trying to transcribe that. Or you could be smart and just be like, hey, I'm going to pay a transcription service to transcribe all my interviews, and hopefully that gets past research ethics, right? And there shouldn't be a problem with it. Interview, not a typo, by the way. Face interviewer variability, right? The way that different interviewers may pose questions or do follow-ups and stuff can be a little bit different, right? There can be some variability between interviewers. And so you might not, especially if you're doing phone or face-to-face interviews, you might not get the same kinds of answers because of the different people doing interviewing. And that can be hard to, that can be hard to kind of control for. Okay. Closed questions. Advantages, it minimizes the intra-interviewer variability and inter-interviewer variability, right? So basically, because the questions are all set and it's just a response set, there's really no way, even if someone's like, you've got a bad interviewer on the phone, or someone's just getting really weary, right? Like, I don't know, I'm working at a phone bank for Leger, and I've phoned 75 people in a day, and I'm getting really tired of asking the same questions, right? It minimizes the kind of fatigue, right? Because it's just like, do you strongly agree, strongly, somewhat agree, neither agree? Like you might be very unenthusiastic, but you're not going to get a difference because the answers are all set. It makes it easier for the questions to understand because the answers are provided, right? And this is what I was talking about with the Likert scale. Right? People are going to instantly sort of understand once they do a couple of them how everything is structured, right? And therefore how they're going to be asked to answer the next question. So as you're reading it, they can already be thinking about their answer, which is helpful. And it means that you're more likely to get a higher completion rate on a survey that you're doing. And closed questions can be answered quickly and easily, which reduces response rate issues. And this is one of the biggest issues that we have in poll or survey research now is poor response rates, right? People get frustrated and fed up, and they quit surveys. We're much more forgiving about it than we were in the past. In the past, if you had a response rate in your chosen population of less than 80%, you probably would have tossed that survey in the garbage. Now we're tolerating things like 10, 15% response rate because responding is such a problem, right? And people's patience for questions really is kind of breaking down. So closed questions make it much easier. Yeah, please.
So what's the difference between intra and inter?
Okay, so intra-interviewer, so like when the same interviewer is asking the same questions over and over again, sometimes they get tired, right? Or they may not ask them the same way every single time. And inter-interviewer is different interviewers, right? So the same person sometimes has a variance, and between interviewers, sometimes you have a variance, right? So does that make sense? I'm gonna say, since you're typing furiously, we'll go with yes. Okay. Oh, Liam. All right. So are we good there? Before I jump forward, I think survey research is fascinating. I hope you do too, because we got a lot of stuff to talk about. Some prominent sources of errors in survey research. Poorly worded questions is probably your number one, right? And this is relatively easily avoided, right, by testing your survey questions in advance, right? Running it by people, especially if you have colleagues who are also good at writing survey questions, right? Having them look over it and check, to see where poorly worded questions might have occurred. Testing it, like piloting it out to see if there's any confusion. And, sometimes, if you ever do like a survey with Leger or Abacus or someone like that, you'll see that sometimes at the end of the survey, they actually have questions about the survey itself, which is like, how easy were the questions in this survey to understand? Like, how easy did you find it to complete this survey? Was the survey interesting? Things like that. But poorly worded questions, right? Relatively easy to avoid, but you can run into real problems if a question is poorly worded, where people may completely misunderstand what you're asking, and therefore, or three people might interpret it differently, and therefore you're going to get a real mess in terms of the data. Interviewer error in asking a question, right? So if you have someone doing phone interviews or in-person interviews, if they read it wrong, right, they misread it, which can definitely happen. Obviously, then this can, they read the question wrong, and then the respondents are going to understand it incorrectly. So that's an intra-interview or inter-interviewer kind of problem, right? Where between different interviewers, they're reading the question differently. That can be a problem. Misunderstanding on the part of the interviewee. There's really not a ton you can do about that other than to word your questions as clearly as possible. Like, think about your possible person doing your interview or your survey as being only capable of reading the Edmonton Sun, and you should have a pretty good bet because it's written at what, like a grade 3 level or something like that. That's probably your best bet. Like simple wording, really, really straightforward. If you need to clarify things within a question, right? So like sometimes you can give a short, and I stress short definition within a question so that people know what you're talking about. But yeah, basically misunderstanding on part of the interviewee. There's only so much you can do to prevent it because sometimes people just don't understand or they're rushing through and they're not paying attention, and that can screw up your data a little bit. You could always correct for major outliers when you're processing the data, but sometimes people just misunderstand the question, right? Okay. Interviewee lapses in memory, and I'm gonna see if I put a little line under here. This is a big one, and a few people, actually not as many people maybe as in other times I've done this, but lapses in memory can be a big problem, right? And actually people's memory is extremely problematic. And you have to sort of assume that people are going to remember things incorrectly. So you almost, with a lot of survey research, you have to be asking about people, things that are really objective in the past. So not things that require someone to really delve into their memory. Or things that are really in the present. Like, how do you feel about this right now? Okay, I'll give you some examples, right? So one of the things that I sometimes see in kind of research questions that are posed for this class is something like the link between how much exercise you did and your level of depression during COVID. Okay, now the inherent problem with a question like that is a perfectly interesting question, right? But the biggest problem with it is, all right, COVID started, March 13th, 2020. So if I asked you, how much exercise were you doing on March 13th, 2020, and how did you feel? Right? It's almost impossible to answer that question because almost guaranteed you don't remember, right? You can sort of make it up, and you can probably past cast on well, I think I was feeling like this, and I probably did about this much exercise. But in a lot of cases, that's more of your reflection in the present as to what you think you were doing at that time than an actual memory, right? And so lapses in memory can be a real problem. And so you often have to structure questions and kind of data you can get from a survey in a way that doesn't actually require you to ask people for very subjective things, right? I'll give you a quick example, and I don't know if this is helpful or not. The day after 9/11, so September 12th, 2001, a professor, I want to say at Boston University, in a psychology class, had all of his students write down, handwrite their account of what happened on September the 11th, 2001, like their memory of it. And 1 year later, and he put them in envelopes, right, with their name on it. And 1 year later, he had them come back and read their account. And for about 40% of the students, they said, this isn't my account. I didn't write this because it's completely different than what I remember. Memory is really fungible, right? It's really changeable in human beings. We rewrite, our memories all the time to fit who we are, how we feel, all these sorts of things. So trusting memory is a real problem. You may not be getting accurate information. What you might actually be getting is how that person feels about something that happened in the past. So if you're going to ask questions about the past, right, and where people have to rely on their memory, they have to be relatively objective, right? So it's like, if you want to know something about, mental health during COVID, you'd have to be like, did you begin treatment for a mental health condition during, let's say from March 2020 until, let's say March 2022. We'll say COVID ended in March 2022, right? So then as a person, it's not so much are they remembering as it's sort of an objective fact, or did you lose your employment or start taking drugs, during this period? Now that still relies on them accurately remembering things, but it's a little bit more objective. Anything that requires, say, reflecting on a subjective state in the past is basically a garbage question, right? You're not going to get accurate information because how did you feel last Tuesday at 11 a.m.? Anyone? Do you remember? No, exactly, right? You can't remember feelings and really subjective things, right? So lapses in memory are big problems. People get stuff wrong. People misremember. People have, rewritten the past in their own mind, so that it seems less traumatic, right? So yeah, you can't, and unless you're going to do something where you deep dive into someone's journals or something, there's no way you can really count on memory. This, by the way, is the same reason when we get to qualitative research that we do field notes, right? So that you as the researcher don't have a chance to rewrite your own memories of an event so that it fits your data better. Okay. That's probably enough said about that. This is, I think, probably the biggest one and something that you really have to be careful of when you're thinking about your research topic and the kind of questions you're asking. Are you asking objective questions about the past or subjective questions? And subjective questions are going to run you right into this brick wall of bad questions where I'm like, no, very, very quickly. I noticed on eClass there's a little stamp I can use that has X's. Well, maybe I should use that more. Red X. All right, I'm kidding. I don't like red. I've always marked things in green because I'm like, green is so much friendlier a color than red to show people that they're wrong. It's like, you're wrong, but in a pleasant color. Okay. I'm weird. I'm sorry. Interviewer error in recording information, right? So if you're doing, again, if you're doing what's usually referred to as computer-assisted telephone interviewing, right? Maybe the interviewer enters something wrong. Like I said, strongly agree, and they entered strongly disagree by accident. There's errors here. This can happen too, even in like online panels where people are doing the thing themselves. They can select the wrong answer accidentally, and if they don't notice, again, there's not a ton you can do to control for this, but it does happen, right? And then you could see individual data sets that look really weird if someone screwed up a couple of points of entry. Okay, mistakes in entering data into a computer file. Right, that's our computer assisted. This happens sometimes, okay, this to me is traumatic, and I don't understand how people do this. And they proposed this for a research project we're doing, and I was like, no, we're not doing that. That sounds insane. It's going to take forever. But you can actually do, and some people do, just print out like an interview you're going to give face-to-face, and you just circle the answers on the paper as you go through, and then later on you sit down and you enter it manually into a computer, which sounds insane to me. And like the one that my boss is going to be doing in prisons in Alberta, it's like an 86 question survey, and they were like, maybe we'll just do these on paper. And I'm like, A, why do you hate trees? B, that's going to take forever to enter, and there's going to be a ton of errors because people are going to get really tired when we go to Edmonton Correctional facilities and there's 1,500 inmates we're interviewing, and somebody has to interview 1,500. So now we're trying to figure out how to do it on iPad so they can just do it right there, which also has its problems. But that's because the company that the U of A contracts is less interested in helping than you might think. Qualtrics. Okay. I had grad students working on this problem for 2 weeks. And finally, I'm like, maybe we just need to buy a different piece of software, because the rep is like, I already have your money. Why do I care? I'm not going to help you. Reps. Okay. There's not a greater hive of scum and villainy in academics than reps for companies, right? Because they already have your money for the most part. Okay. Bias related to characteristics such as gender or race of the interviewers or the interviewees, right? Sometimes people are biased in the way they answer things, right? This has become actually a bigger problem in like the post-COVID, post-Trump kind of era. Like political kind of identities and biases have become so strong that people will actually like torpedo your survey, right? Like because they're trying to make like an ideological point, and it's weird. But yeah, sometimes people have an ideology and they start to see your questions and they're like, I'm gonna like send a message with the way I'm answering these questions, and it's dumb, but it happens, right? Okay, gender, race, politics, all these things can interview or affect how people answer. Okay, disadvantages: loss of spontaneity and authenticity because relevant answers may be excluded from the choices provided. Right? Yeah. Who cares? No. I hate spontaneity and hate authenticity, so no. I think in surveys, right, to me, I get the point, right? This is straight out of the textbook. But I get the point where, yeah, you close off some of the possibilities, but it just makes the process so much easier. Open questions can give you more variety, but I feel like if you want that variety, the better way to solve that is qualitative research and doing a mixed methods project, but that's just me. Yeah, respondents might differ in their interpretations of wordings to fixed responses, like strongly and strongly agree. And I mean, again, sometimes in our analysis, like this is why you often lump, you'll see it if you read social science research, you'll see like, 80% of people answered either agree or strongly agree together, right? And we consider those kind of similar responses because it's like, yeah, there could be some difference in what strongly agree means to certain people. So we'll say that most people who agree are probably kind of in a similar camp as strongly agree. Yeah, respondents might not find a fixed response. And you can always, sometimes you can have a little box that's like other and please explain, and they can type 2-3 words in there, quick and easy. Or sometimes like none of the above, prefer not to answer. There's ways of kind of getting around that problem as well. Although I do have a friend who's a survey writer who hates prefer not to answer as a possibility, and won't put it on any of her surveys, but that's her problem. Okay. Yeah, a bunch of different types of questions. Sorry, I wasn't sure if someone's trying to come in. Okay, personal factual questions. Age, occupation, number of cars owned. Okay, one thing I will say, for things like age, sometimes people want to do, right, what you would think of as like a range, right? So they would put like one of the options is like 18 to 29, right? My recommendation if you're doing surveys is do not do this. No, just ask them to enter either their date of birth, right? Date of birth, or their age as a number, right? I think this is a much stronger option because here, like, there could be a very big difference at the beginning of whatever range you choose and the end of the range you choose, right? Like people who are 18 and people who are 29. And okay, that's a really wide range, but I've seen ranges like that. I'm giving you very practical survey advice from someone who's made mistakes in the past. Yeah, so like, to my mind, you can class this data afterwards, right? So you can break them into categories that you feel are relevant afterwards based on what you're finding in the data. If all you have is this sort of block number 18 to 29, I'm sorry, I'm making a big mess on my own slide. Then it can be hard to see what's inside that number and whether there's a difference in those ranges, right? And I mean, I've seen people, or, if you're trying to be too granular in your selections, right, what you're gonna have is like, 18 to 21, 18 to 21, 22 to 24, and then there's too many choices. And again, this reduces the chances that people are going to answer, right? They're going to be like, I'm confused. This question scares me. Goodbye. So I think with age especially, or something like number of cars, right? Just put an open box and they can enter whatever the number is, like just a raw number. And that would be my recommendation. And now I don't know, can I erase my own thing to make my slide cleaner again? I don't remember. All right, no worries. Okay, I'll no worries. Okay, yeah. So occupation, right? What we often see with occupation questions is people will tend to class it by industry. This is probably the right way to do it, right? So it's like, do you work as a professional, an engineer, science and technology, education, right? Because if you actually get into letting people enter their specific jobs, you're going to have, trades, you're going to have a billion different ones, right? Like just in the trades, you could have plumbers, carpenters, welders, blah, 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 blah. It's going to be kind of hard to make sense of that data, and you're going to need to classify that and probably code it in some way anyway. So instead, I would say occupation, something like that, just put it into categories. Race or ethnicity, right? Those can be tricky ones as well for lots of reasons. But you could, I think typically like a list is the best way to go, and let people kind of identify however they want, because opening it up to a box in that case could get you some very strange answers that you then have to classify. So age, because it's going to be easy to classify because it's just a number. But other kind of personal things, you might not want to open it up as much. Okay, so sorry, does that all make sense? I know, I'm being very granular about this. Factual questions about others. So you could ask, people's opinions about other groups or other people. Like, what's your opinion of, a politician or a particular group of people in society? They could be problematic because people may not know, right? People might have limited knowledge. In questions where you're asking maybe about something factual, you might want to ask, like if you're asking, hey, do you know what, so you could ask something like, how much do you think you know about, I don't know, let's think about something random. The university's, what is it called, SHAPE or SNAP or whatever, plan for developing the university. And you could have know a lot, know a little, know very little, and know nothing, right? You could have those kinds of things to get a sense of what people's knowledge is. But if you're asking factual questions, like, you're like, you put a Likert scale and you're like, the university president's plan for the college system at the U of A is the best way forward, right? And it's like strongly agree, or somewhat agree, or agree, somewhat disagree. You might run into the problem where people are like, oh, what? The who, what? They just don't know things. So factual questions can be problematic. Sometimes you might want to like give people a way out, right? Prefer not to answer or don't know, as a kind of way out of those questions. So they're not like, I strongly agree, but I actually don't know what that is. So, give them a way out, or not applicable, something like that. Questions about perceptions of others, so like, how do you feel about Bill Flanagan as president of the university? Something like that. Or I like Bill Flanagan, strongly agree, strongly disagree. I like Justin Trudeau, strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? Those are all acceptable. But things about specific types of knowledge, right? I think Canada's trade policy with the United States is problematic, right? People may just not know the answer to that because people are not always paying attention to everything. I find this with brand questions, actually. A lot of the surveys I've done on Leger, they're like, how do you feel about this brand? And I'm like, what? Like, I don't know, like Artisia or something like that. I'm like, I think I've seen a sign on a store one time, but I can't remember where, or, those kinds of things, right? It's like, I don't feel that good about it. Or H&M, it's like, I've never been into a store. Yeah, please.
So if someone answers, like if you give them a layout and then you do not answer, I don't know, you just kind of like throw out that response then?
Typically, yeah, like you'd be like, this person doesn't have anything relevant to say, especially if it's a prefer not to answer. Like you can include it in the reporting that, 40% of people, if you're doing brand research, it's like, I think H&M provides great quality merchandise at low prices. If you have a lot of people that don't know, in a corporate setting, it'd be like, yeah, I think our brand doesn't have that good of exposure, right? Maybe people don't know. So it could be useful information too. But yeah, a lot of times it's like, I prefer not to answer is one that you can often just like be like, although I see it included a lot, and sometimes it's like, like some things where I think it's like really kind of silly, and I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? Like, things like, what is your religious identity? Don't know. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? I have a whole list of things here. Pick one, right? But then there's like 8% that just say don't know, and I'm like, I don't understand what's in that don't know, but a lot of times people will report it anyway. So it can be useful, but yeah, I mean, sometimes it you might be able to say, of the people who don't know on this question, you know, they might have these characteristics too. So sometimes you can just toss them. Prefer not to answer is often less useful because it's just like people being recalcitrant about something and for no reason. But yeah, I guess it depends on. Now you're just making me think on my feet. I'm like, I've definitely used the people who don't know to be like, yeah, these people are very unsure about things that they obviously should know. So, but yeah, you can do a lot of things with them. Some people will just toss away, especially prefer not to answer. If you have a lot of don't know, it could also be a sign that your question sucks, right? Because people just don't understand what you're saying. So it might be a moment to reflect, especially in a pilot study, and be like, I think this is a bad question, right? So there's uses for it, but sometimes it's just to give people an escape hatch too that don't want to answer, depending on what kind of survey it is too. Sometimes people get really uncomfortable with what you're asking. So does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, the last one, factual questions about an entity or event, accounts of a political demonstration. Yeah, it can be problematic because people might not remember, right? Or they might not have observed it, right? Like, if you're asking questions about the January 6th riots in the US Capitol, right? Not everybody was paying attention, so questions about that can be problematic. What's your opinion of that? Okay, that can be okay, but like a factual question like, I don't know, do you remember Donald Trump, tweeting afterwards? Like a lot of people wouldn't have been paying attention. So you might not want to ask questions that are that specific, especially if you think people weren't paying attention, right? Okay, does that all make sense? Okay. Yeah, questions about attitudes are very common, right? And we talked about, this one makes me laugh because they drew a house in the no. I don't know why it makes me laugh. I spent a lot of time on Google Images trying to find fun images to go with this. Yeah, questions about attitudes are really, really common, right? Like, I am disappointed in the government of Canada for inviting a former member of the Waffen SS to Parliament, right? Like, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Those kinds of things, like people's attitudes. Like, I think Justin Trudeau is doing a great job on the economy, and the Liberal Party, right? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. I think Professor Broussard belongs in an insane asylum, not in front of a class. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. Attitudes, easy to ask. And so we'll honestly see a lot of kind of attitude questions. The reason it works really well too is because obviously people know what their own attitudes are, right? So it's very easy to get people to state what their attitude is typically, as opposed to like factual knowledge about events that they might not have a great sense of, like, which person shot JFK, right? You might not get great answers because people might just not know. But it's like, do you believe, or do you think, or let's say, put it in a statement, I think JFK was assassinated by the CIA. That's an easy one because people obviously know what they think about that. Beliefs, right? Things like, existence of God is my example, right? Easy to ask about what people believe, or do you believe healthcare should be universal? I believe healthcare should be universal, right? Always Likert scales, you always want to use this. As I set them up, I always have to correct myself because I sometimes ask them as a question. They should typically be as a statement, right? But, I believe healthcare should be universal and covered by the state, right? Easy for people to answer more or less. They know what they believe for the most part. And I mean, again, you can have the don't know question there. If people just don't know, they can put that. And it kind of works pretty well. They're easy to set up. And they're, generally you can write the questions in such a way as to reduce kind of errors, right? Where people don't understand what you're asking. Just make sure that it's pretty clear. Okay. And I mean, they can be long or they can be short. Shorter is typically better. Questions about knowledge. Used to test respondents' knowledge. Who was the first Prime Minister of Canada? I can't think of to be honest, I can't think of a question like that. I can't think of a circumstance where I would ask it. But things you could ask in terms of people's knowledge, you could be like, oh, I should look in my own survey to see how I asked this because I'm just doing this from memory. But it's like, Covenant Health, operates hospitals and care facilities in Alberta. How aware, including the Grey Nuns and Misericordia hospitals and a bunch of others, you can list them. How aware are you of the work done by Covenant Health? And you can be like, very aware, somewhat aware, not very aware, not aware at all, right? You can have sort of like, it's less of a like information testing question, but you could be like, do you know anything about this? And then you could follow that up with, other questions, about the specifics, like of what they know within that. It's like, how much do you know about the Misericordia Hospital's policy on, medical assistance in dying, right? You could ask those sorts of questions. Or what is, I don't know that a what is question would be my favorite, because it's like a skills testing question to enter a contest, but you could ask it in that way. I wouldn't, but you certainly can. Okay, how does that all strike you? I know these are a lot of different question types, but as you go to compose your survey, right, it's very useful to know what you can write. Okay, I will say, as a useful exercise, it wouldn't hurt even just to see, we learn to do by seeing what other people have done in the past and by doing things. You can go to something like Leger Web, right? And just, put it into your phone. They have an app. You can sign up. You can even get rewards if you do enough of their surveys, though it does get a bit tiresome after a while. And just go through a couple of surveys that Leger runs, right? Just to see what kind of questions they're asking. Because it can be a really, and anytime I'm writing a survey, I always go and do this just to be like, remind myself, A, what kind of questions other people are writing, and B, what kind of questions really kind of piss me off and make me want to quit surveys, because you can just kind of stay away from the stuff that you find aggravating. And there's a good chance that if you find it aggravating, other people are going to find it aggravating too. I really have to remember not to put black on because this board doesn't show black very well. I could redesign this slide in like 30 seconds so it's more visible. Hang on. Do I want to keep my annotation? No. It was ugly. Okay. There we go. That should be a little easier to see. Ta-da. Yes, but smaller. Okay. I've made it better and worse. Okay. Rules for designing your question. Keep your research question in mind, right? What is it you're trying to find out? And don't stray too far afield from what you ultimately want to know, right? So, if you're asking for people's attitudes about transit, you don't want to drift off and ask how they, do they think that Edmonton city roads are well maintained, right? Well, those might be linked concepts in some ways, right? It's like the pothole problems in Edmonton and transit are sort of linked because they both have to do with getting places. If your research question is people's attitudes about transit, you don't want to stray off into other things. And trust me, there is a ton of discipline problems. I've done enough surveys in my life to see where, people maybe have this thought of like, well, I'm here. I could also ask about this. And that can get you into some troublesome places where suddenly you've taken a 10-minute detour on your survey into uncharted waters that have nothing to do with what you actually wanted to know. You generate a bunch of data that then you're like, well, I have all this data. What the hell do I do with it? And you've aggravated the people taking your survey because you've taken a bit detour off of, a set of questions that sort of make sense and are thematically linked. Making your survey longer than it has to be is always a mistake. It's like a balance between how long does it have to be to get my information, but can I compact it enough that it's like 15, 20 minutes to do, right? And again, you're not going to write that many questions because you write 5 for the mini lab and then you write 10 for the major lab. So you don't have to worry as much about like, can someone do this in 20 minutes? Because 10 questions shouldn't take you that long. But, if you were doing this, later on and you're actually going to run a survey, I'd say 15, 20 minutes, and you're going to start losing people in big numbers because they're going to get tired and frustrated. And look, on Leger Web, if I see a survey and it says 30 minutes, I won't even start it, right? It's too long. I don't have 30 minutes of my time to give most of the time. And also, I can almost guarantee that they've done something dumb and they're asking a bunch of dumb questions in dumb ways. And it is fun for me to go through and make fun of them and then snapshot them and send them to my friends and be like, this is a really stupid question. Why would anyone ask this? But I have limited time to do so. Okay. Focus on exactly what you want to know and be specific. Standard of living. You would ask, how many children are living at home versus how many children do you have, right? I don't even know why you would ask how many children do you have, to be honest. Yeah, but please go ahead.
How do you spell Leger?
Leger is Leger. I think there's an accent on the E, accent aigu on the E, because it's a Quebec company. But if you just spell it Leger, it's Leger or Leger. But it's actually pronounced Leger. I made that mistake a couple times, and people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Leger, dude, it's Leger. I'm like, oh, well, that makes way more sense. Anyway, embarrass yourself. Never do it. Do some surveys, right? See what angers you, and trust me, like when it asks you to rate, it gives you a table, and it asks you to rate 15 brands on this perfect on this 1 to 10 scale. You're going to get very frustrated. And when you load the next page and they ask you to do 15 more brands, you're then going to quit that survey. Because I've done that multiple times. I'm like, yeah, no, this is taking too long. So be specific, right? How many children are living at home versus how many children do you have? So asking how many, cost of living, right? How many children do you have in general might not be a very useful question versus how many children do you have living at home, right? It's like, okay, how many people are you paying for, are you paying for them to be at home? Are they eating your food and that sort of thing, right? How many cars do you own might be less useful than how many cars do you operate, right? How many cars do you have running? Because, someone might have 5 cars, but 3 of them are broken down in the back alley and they're really only running 2 of them, right? Or how many cars do you drive on a daily basis? That kind of stuff. And then, put yourself in the position of the respondent. How would you answer the question, right? So do your own survey, right? And now this can be a problem because sometimes we have blinders on. So my advice is always have your mom do your survey, or someone that is probably less interested in the topic that you're studying than you are. I swear I had the big survey I ran on Catholic agencies in Alberta, my first test people were my parents. I'm like, do this survey for me and tell me what you think of the questions. And you know what? Funnily enough, they're not experts in any way. Dad's an electrician. My mom was a school teacher, both retired now. But they had some really good feedback on how they're like, this question is really wordy. And I'm like, yes, it is. I will fix that, right? Non-specialists testing your question, one of the best things to do, right? If you can convince the barista at Starbucks do you have 2 minutes on your break to just try my survey? I'll buy you a coffee. Great person to test because they don't care about you and they'll be perfectly mean to your survey, and they won't feel bad about it, right? So, and my parents being the way they are with me, they don't care about being mean to me either. So it all kind of works out. Oh my God, it's so hot in here. It's like 1,000 degrees. I'm like, is class over yet? Oh, hi, it's Justin Trudeau. Our team is dedicated to delivering on priorities that matter most to Canadians. But Pierre Poilievre is trying to roll back. I swear, that's a text I got just now. This is a fundraising text. Give us money. To which I answer, how did you get this number? Oh, good times. Okay. I think I donated to the Liberals prior to Trudeau being in government, and they will never let me forget it. Okay. Avoid ambiguous terms. Even commonly used terms might be vague, right? So, income, does it include tips, right? If you're in the service industry, investment income, after-tax income, right? Yeah, so sometimes, like, what's your annual income before taxes is a pretty common question. Wealth, like something like wealth, really nebulous concept. Like, you wouldn't want to use that particular term. Yeah, anything that you can do to be really, really specific. Like, you wouldn't want to ask, how religious are you, right? Because it's like, well, what does religious mean? It might vary very much by the person. So you would want to ask specific questions about categories within that, right? So yeah, like, after-tax income, right? That's a pretty easy one. Although, even then, I'm like, people will typically know their before-tax income because they'll know their salaries, right? Like, you're asking me, I don't know what my after-tax income is, less than I'd like it to be, but I know what my salary is, right? So, total amount of salary in your household or total salaries in your household is a pretty easy one because people will generally know the raw number before taxes easier, right? So you just want to think about that. Like, are you asking in a way that people will be able to answer? Like, if you ask me, what's your after-tax income? I would have to go and look at my CRA forms. I'd have no idea, right? Yeah, so just make sure that you're asking it in a way that they can answer. You could ask about roughly how much money they bring home every month after taxes. That's one that people will generally have a pretty good sense of. But that kind of stuff, right? Don't ask what a person's tax bracket is because they'll have absolutely no idea. Okay, avoid long questions. Now, obviously, you saw some of my questions and they were pretty long. Sometimes you can't get away from it because, sometimes in order to elicit the information you need, you have to ask a relatively long question. However, as much as you can, make the question as short as possible, right? Sometimes it can't be avoided. Sometimes you have to give people a little bit of background, right? You have to give them a little bit of information. It's like, hey, these hospitals are operated by Covenant Health. How much do you know? So in the Misericordia Grey Nuns, how much do you know about the work done by, or do you agree with the following statement then that these hospitals should be aired? Or, Covenant Health, which operates the Misericordia and Grey Nuns hospitals, is funded by provincial funds. Given that they are funded by provincial funds, they should be allowed to blah, 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 right? That's a pretty long question, but I don't know that there's a way around it without creating the confusion of people not knowing enough to answer. So as you're thinking about it, just be really, really cognizant of going too long, right? And this can be with your answer sets too, right? Sometimes people looking for very specific information will write really long answer sets, where each point is like, I don't know. I'm trying to remember. I've seen some in the past where it was like, describe your mental health status, and they have like 15 words in each answer set. That's a problem too, because people are going to then get tired looking at that answer set and trying to figure out how they should answer, right? It's like, okay, I read all the answer sets, but I forget what the question is. I have to go back and read the question, which is also long. So try to keep everything as compact as possible. That doesn't mean everything has to be like, very, very short, but just like, as you're thinking about it, it's like, is this as compact as it can be, or could I shorten it even a little bit, right? Okay, and the last one, this is super important. I'm going to make a big red arrow pointing towards it. Because people do this all the time, and I've seen professional survey writers for places that run stuff through Leger ask questions like this, and it's infuriating. So a double-barreled, or even, I have seen the dreaded triple-barreled question. A double-barreled question is basically a question that is asking about two things at the same time. And because it's asking about two things, you will not know, as the person interpreting the data, which thing they are responding to, and it may confuse the person answering it because, it might not be both of those things, right? Was the course interesting and informative? Well, those are two different questions, right? Like, was it interesting? Maybe. Was it informative? Maybe, right? But if you ask if it's interesting and informative, as a person answering it, I'm like, well, which one am I really answering, right? And how do I say What if it was interesting but not informative? How do I then answer the question? It can be hard for your respondents to figure that out. Are you satisfied with your pay and working conditions? Is an even better answer, right? Because, or question, because, you know, I might very well be satisfied with my pay, right? Oop, my penny's not working. Work. All right, it has died. Sad pen. Needs a new battery. All right, I'll do that later. Right, so you might be happy with your pay, right? You're working at a job and you make 6 figures, but the working conditions suck, right? You have to work 15 hours, or sorry, not 15 hours, that'd be great. 75 hours a week, right? So it's like, or, your working environment is quite dirty. If someone is then like, and the answer, very dissatisfied, well, which one is it that they're very dissatisfied with? And trust me, I've seen all sorts of questions from students, from professional survey writers, where you accidentally end up double-barreling your question and the data ends up being useless, right? And like I said, I've even seen the dreaded triple-barreled question where someone accidentally ends up asking about 3 things at once. And then it's like, then I just make fun of it. Then that's when I have a good time. I'm like, woohoo, the triple-barreled question. You don't want to see that feedback on your mini lab. It's like, you have wandered into the realm of the dreaded triple-barreled question. I don't think I've ever seen a quadruple-barreled question because you'd have to try pretty hard to ask about 4 things at once. But I've definitely seen a triple-barreled question. Okay, how do we? So, in case you can't tell what I want you to do, avoid. Don't do those things, right? And I will point them out if you've asked a double-barreled question. More things to avoid. See, again, avoid. Avoid. Yeah, avoid very general questions. What do you think about the Catholic Church? What do you think about the Prime Minister? What do you think about the University of Alberta, right? You want to make sure that you're asking, like, if you're asking about the Prime Minister, you would want to ask, say, about his performance on the economy, right? Or his hair. What do you think about Justin Trudeau's hair? Are you jealous? How jealous are you? Very jealous. Actually, his hair's not as good as it used to be, frankly. It used to be much fluffier. Time has not been kind. I'm less jealous of his hair than I once was. Right? What do you think about the leader of the opposition, right? Or, those kinds of things. You don't want to ask the very general questions, like, what do you think about his potential to be prime minister? What do you think about Monsieur Poilievre's potential to be prime minister, right? Make sure it's not just general. Like, what do you think about him in general? It's like, okay, what aspect of him? Or like, what aspect of the university? Like, I like my degree, but I think the classrooms are too damn warm. Right, so you want to be really specific in what you're asking. Okay, that one's pretty easy. Avoid leading questions. Should the monarchy, which costs taxpayers $5 million per year, be abolished, right? Do you think Justin Trudeau, who invited a Nazi to Parliament, should resign? Right? I'm kidding, I'm joking a little bit, but you don't want to lead people to like an obvious answer. The city of Edmonton, which operates poor roads and is mostly potholes. What do you think about the roads here? Right? Well, I think you've already told me what you want me to answer. So don't lead the question. You want to make sure that people are sort of free to answer in such a way, and you're not putting like negative information, right? It's like, should the monarchy be abolished is a perfectly fine question. Should the monarchy, which is now run by Charles, who is probably responsible for the death of the beloved Princess Diana, be abolished? A much more leading question, right? And you don't want to do that, so like if you omit the opinion piece in the middle, you're in much better shape. So avoid questions that are actually 2 questions. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like Stephen King novels? That's not terrible. It's not the worst question, but better, do you read Stephen King novels? On a scale of 1 to 5, how, if so, yeah, so you read Stephen King novels on a scale of 1 to 5. How much do you like Stephen King novels? Right? Because in the first question, you're assuming that they read Stephen King novels, but you actually don't know, right? And you shouldn't assume something that, you might want to ask about, right? If you need to, if it's not obvious, right, you definitely should ask and then have a follow-up question. The nice thing about doing all of this in a piece of software too, even something as commercial or as consumer grade as SurveyMonkey, is they have routing. So if people answer no, then they just go to another question that doesn't have to do with Stephen King novels. But yeah, do you read Stephen King novels on a scale of 1 to 5? What do you think about them, right? Those are better ways of asking those questions. Okay, and now I have avoid, minimize, and B as my headers. So avoid the top one, minimize the middle one, and be sure on the last one. Okay, avoid include questions that include negatives, especially double negatives. Do you oppose the rules stating that laptops are not allowed in class? Right? It's a little bit of a confusing question, right? It's like, what would be a better way to ask it? Like, should professors be allowed to ban the use of laptops in classes, right? Or a statement, professors should be allowed to ban the use of laptops in classes, right? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. As opposed to, do you oppose the rule? Okay, do I oppose the rule? What's the rule? Stating that laptops are not allowed in class. So laptops not allowed, right? Okay, there's a lot of thinking. I know it seems like a straightforward question, but there's more thinking in that question than you need there to be. So just, I would say put this as a statement. I oppose rules stating that laptops are not allowed in class. It's still not great. I oppose professors banning laptops in classes, right? It's much simpler. So, just try to keep the questions as simple as possible. Minimize technical terms. I don't want to say assume that the person taking your survey is stupid, but maybe assume the person taking your survey is stupid or is not a technical expert, right? Dumb it down as much as you can. Avoid jargon. Jargon is the enemy of, jargon is the friend of people who write social theory. It's the enemy of people who want their survey completed, right? So write in really plain terms, right? Anything that's technical language or even academic language, right? So are you in favor of decarceration? Right? Would be a really bad question because I guarantee there would be a lot of people that don't know what decarceration is, like letting people out of prison, right? Or as opposed to, do you think steps should be taken to reduce the number of people who are in prison? A much better question in the sense that you're not using, a term that people might be confused by, what is your opinion of the carceral state? I don't know what that is, right? So avoid those kinds of academic-y type jargons, right? Assuming like half of you are criminologists, because that seems to be the way sociology is going. But anyway, yeah. Minimize technical terms. Be sure that respondents have the knowledge to answer, right? So like on that Stephen King question, right? If you're going to ask a bunch of things about Stephen King novels, what this comes down to is, I think my pen's still not working. Oh, it's working again. Okay. I won't write it because my handwriting's messy. What you want sometimes is a screening question, right? And a screening question, okay, this is what will happen to you also. When you do Leger surveys, you're going to answer a bunch of screening questions typically to start a survey, right? All right, so an easy one, right? You're interested in the attitudes of Edmontonians and you're putting things in an online panel. You might get people stray in there for reasons. You might ask something like, do you live in the city of Edmonton, right? Because you're going to assume that if someone doesn't live in the city of Edmonton, they're not going to have the knowledge to answer your specific questions about Mayor Sohi or potholes on Edmonton roads or Edmonton Transit. If you want, knowledge about Edmonton Transit, you would want to, ask, do you regularly take transit in Edmonton? and then what'll happen is if someone answers no, it'll boot them out of the survey on an online survey, right? It'll kick them out and it'll be like, thanks for your time. We're actually looking for a different set of people, but please, select a different survey to do on Leger Web. These are really important, right? Having proper screening questions when you're doing a survey, because otherwise, like say on the transit question, you might get my dad answering that. My dad has not taken transit in 20 years, but he has very strong opinions on transit. So you could get a bunch of cranks like my dad. My dad's lovely, but he's older and cranky about things. And so you might get a bunch of information from people who don't even ride transit. But if you ask the proper screening questions, right? Do you read Stephen King novels? If not, you don't really have it, rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. Well, I can't, I don't read them, so make sure that they have knowledge. Screening questions are your best friend. And the software that's out there now, like I said, even consumer grade software like SurveyMonkey will filter a lot of that out, right? And it'll just boot people from the survey, or if you have multiple sections of your survey, it'll kick them to the next section, right? And then you'll have screening questions there that you'll then ask, do they have the knowledge to do that part? So yeah, you say, be sure they have the respondents have the knowledge, and you can mark under their screening questions, right? Okay, pretty straightforward. What are we doing for time? That clock is always fast, deceptively so. Okay, we got like 12 minutes left. Yeah, right. Okay, sorry. Yeah, you want to make sure symmetry between closed answer question and its answers, right? So you want to make sure that your response set, I know this sounds stupid and obvious, but people screw this up all the time. You want to make sure that your answer set actually fits, right? Like how satisfied are you with your life? Very good, good, middling, poor, very poor. Obviously doesn't make sense, right? And it's a dumb example, but it works, right? It should be very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, etc., right? How would you rate your health, right? Would make sense here, right? For very good, good, middling, poor, very poor. That makes a lot more sense, right? So you're just like ensuring the symmetry, that the answer set that you're giving fits the question that you're asking, right? Okay, yeah, ensure that answers are balanced, right? In terms of your scale. So, like here, right? Overall, the quality of instruction in this course was excellent, very good, good, satisfactory, poor. The obvious problem there is that if you cluster these, right, all of these three are good, and there's only 2 poor. So better, right, would be to have 2 good ones, a neutral one, and then 2 bad ones, right? So it was excellent, good, or very, very good, good, neither good nor bad, satisfactory, or actually satisfactory even can be kind of good. That's way too. Somewhat poor, very poor, right? You want to make sure that it's balanced so that the scale isn't tilted in one way. And sometimes I've seen corporate research, right, on brands do this sometimes where the scale is a bit tilted, because obviously whoever's writing it probably wants that brand showing in the best light. So they'll tilt the scale, right? And sometimes you see this with people who are trying to elicit a certain kind of answer. They have a tilted scale, right? You don't want that. You want it to be very balanced so that you're showing like a gradient of kind of equivalent things, right? So yeah, here I was actually wrong, right? Excellent, very good, good, and satisfactory are all somewhat positive, right? Whereas the only one that's bad is poor. You wouldn't want that, because then anyone who was kind of unsatisfied would just put poor, and so you'd have a bunch of really negative answers, but you're also tilting the scale, where people are more likely to, to go in that positive direction because there's just more options. Okay, sorry, keep checking the time. I don't want to keep you all too long. Yeah, don't overstretch people's memories. Don't expect respondents to recall what they've done or observed in detail, right? So you have to be reasonable. Like, think about it. I think always ask yourself the question, right? Like, don't expect people to recall what they've done or observed. So like if you're like, I gave the examples earlier, how did you feel on March 4th of last year? Obviously, right, that's something they lived through, but they might not have recorded it. Here, the number of hours spent online per week. You could ask, this is a question I see people ask all the time. I think daily is probably the better one, right? Where people are going to be able to tell you like, oh, how much time, do you spend on Instagram in a day, right? And people will have a little bit better knowledge of that because they can think back to yesterday, right? And be like, oh, I think yesterday I spent about 2 hours on Instagram, right? Whereas, I don't know, think about it like, if I'm like, how much time did I spend last week or last month on Instagram? For me, the answer is always 0. So that one's easy. But if you talk about Twitter, it's a totally different story. I like the pain and the shit show that is Twitter for some reason. But right, number of hours in a week, right? Then a person's having to think like, okay, all right, Saturday, Sunday, how much was that? I'm not sure. You can still ask these types of questions. You just have to be a little bit more specific, like how many hours a day. And what they're probably going to reflect on is either how much time have I spent on it today, or how much time did I spend on it yesterday, right? And that they'll know a little bit better, right? And so it's like, on average, how much time do you spend on Instagram every day? That one's answerable because people will just be like, yeah, probably about 2 hours. A week, it's like 2 plus 2 plus 2, definitely more on Sundays. So yeah, might overstretch them a little bit. My friend Dorothy made me put this in. Carefully consider don't know options. Should be avoided generally if possible, though you see it a lot, right? Yeah, sometimes it's people put it in there because they're not wanting to make something what's called a forced question, right? Where you essentially have to answer in order to move on, right? And sometimes, that's seen as a poor practice, like too many forced answers is putting people in a high pressure kind of situation that ultimately might be too much. It might lead people to desist. So sometimes people put don't know as a kind of escape valve. But as I think we said a moment ago, right, sometimes that can actually hide data that might be really, really important. If you have filter questions to make sure people do have knowledge of the thing, right, so you're using their screening questions correctly, you shouldn't need a don't know. Sometimes, a prefer not to answer might actually be better. Like this is, okay, so this one drives me crazy. My boss, they're writing a survey to do in prisons. And the first question on the survey is, how old are you? And it's like, they have basically a box to enter their age, and then they have a don't know option. And I'm like, we had a fight about this. I'm like, why do you have don't know as a possibility on age? Like, who doesn't know what age they are? And it's like, well, sometimes people in prison are wanting to like bullshit you. And I'm like, so just record the bullshit. Don't know. That doesn't make any sense. Or what's your date of birth? Like, people know their date of birth generally. I don't care who you are. But it's like, well, we don't want to put too much pressure on them to answer. I'm like, it's your date of birth. It's not a high pressure type of question. Anyway, we had a fight about this, and we had quite a disagreement. She won because she pays the bill. But I thought it was a kind of stupid place to put a don't know question. But hey, I don't make the choices. In this case, it's not even a filter question. But avoid putting don't know in places that it just doesn't belong, right? Or where you need the data to make sense of the data later. And people do this all the time, put don't know or prefer not to answer. And sometimes you do just need a forced answer because you want that piece of data. Or because then you won't know how to classify that particular case, right? Or that particular subject if you don't have that answer. Okay, I'm gonna say, I know we have a little bit of time left, but I think I've lost 80% of my body weight in sweat standing up here. So let's call her a day. And I threw a lot of survey-based information at you today. So we'll come back on Tuesday for another, did we only cover 15 slides? Okay, we have another 18 slides to cover. I'm sorry. I love surveys so much.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question for the lab. So for the operational for sleep pattern and quality, I was saying how we would take the sleep quality scale, but I kind of wanted to say like information if you have like an Apple Watch would be more important and take that more into consideration. Is that something I should include or no?
So the problem would be that it would be really difficult to assume that everybody has an Apple Watch, right? Like I might have a Fitbit, you might have a Samsung watch, and I don't know, but are they all measuring sleep the same, right?
Oh, okay.
So it's like my Fitbit gives me a sleep score out of 100. I don't know what the Apple Watch does,
So
right?
it's better to just have the sleep.
I would have the diagnostic tool built into the survey rather than because like some people may not have an Apple Watch, right? So I think just questions that you can
Okay,
ask.
and
would be
then
better.
just last time I put it in a doc and you said you didn't want that, but there's a lot of information written here. Do you still want it in the text?
Yeah, it'll just create pages, and then everything for me is on one screen, and I don't have to like
Okay, perfect.
tab back and forth.
Okay.
Hello.
So this was my original question. How much money does the university students in Canada make on campus monthly?
Right.
You responded via this. I just
Yeah.
it there for me to remember. I understand what you were asking by saying like, I think it was an interesting question in and of itself, but it wouldn't like generate many questions to ask because of it.
Right. You're sort of asking a single question, like how much money do you spend on campus every month?
Yeah.
You would have no insight into where, why,
Yes.
under what circumstances.
So then,
Yeah.
this is what I was wondering if I could change it to. Sorry, I wrote a lot here. What is the relationship between students and spending money on campus? Would that be better, or still be too not even generalized enough?
I'm not understand that. I don't understand what that question is asking, right?
Okay.
Because like, if you're asking like why students spend, like what is the relationship between students and spending money on campus? I'm not sure what the question is asking at that point, right? It's a little bit too maybe Spartan in its wording.
Okay.
Like, what specifically do you want to know about students spending on campus?
I was thinking more like how much they spend, like generally like a range, and then also I guess I suppose I can ask like where. And
Yeah,
then
like
kinda,
on what? Like, you know,
Yeah. Okay.
like, because, right, is it food? Is
Yeah.
it drink?
Yeah,
Is
books and
it,
such, yeah.
are they buying clothes? Are they buying Gundams in that one shop in Hub Mall that
Yeah,
sells
yeah,
like anime models, right?
Yeah.
Like there could be a lot of things. I mean, I think you're going to find it's mostly food and drink. That's going to be the biggest thing consumed. But yeah, like it's in that, what is the relationship between students? It's like you're actually asking like, what do students spend money on campus, right? Like that's what you're actually kind of trying to find out is what they spend money on campus.
So if I were to ask that though, would that still be quantitative enough, or would that still not be like?
Oh, I mean, you can certainly ask that, and then you could break it down. You know, like you could break it down by time of day. Like, oh, do you typically spend money on food only in the mornings, morning and afternoon? You know, like there's a few ways you could ask it. You know, what do you typically buy in the morning? Food and coffee, coffee and coffee, coffee and coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee.
Sure.
You know, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's just what's the relationship between students and spending money on campus? Ultimately, it would be like they do, right?
Yeah.
So you'd want to be like, what is, if you're looking for a relationship test, you're kind of asking a question like, is there a particular type of student that is spending more money than others, right? So you might, I mean, and that could be an interesting question. Do students who live at home spend more money on campus? Or do students who live in residence spend more money on campus, right? There's all sorts of things that you could ask. That'd be a sort of relationship, but just relationship between students and spending money on campus. Yes, right? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and then if I were to change it, sorry, because there's line.
Yeah, I know. I'll probably have to
What is
step
the
up.
link between athletes and stress? Would that be a better way to do it, maybe? I'm thinking about changing it after that.
What is the link between athletes?
The brackets are just more like
Yeah.
specifying in case.
Yeah, like time. I would just say like time spent training by athletes and stress, and then you're just gonna need a measure of stress, right? So like, and I think there's probably existing scales that you could use to test.